Gives me great pleasure to introduce Ian Thorpe, who requires a little introduction, at least locally. Ian is one of Australia's greatest athletes, winning 9 Olympic gold medals, 11 World Championship titles, breaking 22 world records. He recently received an AM order for Order of Service for his significant contribution to the service to youth and Indigenous education and swimming. He's been a staunch advocate for LGBTIQA+ rights and in all areas of sport, and he's dedicated to improving the mental health for Australians. Thank you, Ian, for joining us today to discuss tackling homophobia and biphobia in sport. Please welcome Ian.
Thanks, Foz. Thank you for that. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet here today, the Gadigal people, for protecting the land which we meet, the air that we breathe, and the water that we drink and enjoy in this beautiful place. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and those who are emerging. I'd like to thank everyone here today also for coming and having an understanding of what issues we're facing as part of the LGBTIQ community. I'd like to introduce myself. I am Ian Thorpe, indeed. I identify as he and him, and for those who may be visually impaired, I am around 193 centimetres tall, similar to Andrew, who's presenting here. I am wearing navy. I have a navy jacket on, I have a navy t-shirt on, I have a navy pair of pants on. It seems I like navy. So let me just briefly begin with an introduction to what my sporting career looked like in the early years. As a 14-year-old, I had come from being a talented young swimmer to being on the national team. When I had just turned 15, I became the youngest world champion in swimming. When I was 16, I broke 4 world records in 4 days. When I was 17, I actually fulfilled my dream, which was to become Olympic champion, and I had the privilege of doing that at a home Olympic Games here in Sydney. I also, during that time, I continued on swimming after that. I didn't just stop at 18, but when I was 18, it really was when I started my work in social justice causes, initially around Indigenous health and education. And this continued throughout my swimming career and has led me to having an active role in the marriage equality, postal vote and debate in this country, and making sure that all Australians would be treated equally. So I took an active role in that. I've continued my work within the LGBTI community in Australia, killing a couple of terrible bills in Parliament, which was the Religious Discrimination Bill, which was something that would have impinged on the rights of not only gay people, but also people of faith. This had no friends in Parliament, and thank goodness it has been buried, as we'd say. Even though there will be a new iteration of it under the Labor government, it seems to be something that will actually support the rights of people in this room and who are watching this, and for people who believe in the value of equality and also protecting people's right of faith. I also happen to chair athlete health and wellness and education for the AIS, so it has given me a great deal of insight into what is homophobia in sport. I'd like to give you a little bit of my experience around homophobia in sport, and a lot of people will think that it comes directly from other athletes, and that really wasn't the case for me. A lot of mine was led by the media, in fact, and this kind of fascination that people had with my sexuality. I had heard that I had been rumoured to be gay from when I was a 14-year-old. I was directly asked by a journalist when I was 16 if I was gay. That journalist was told, if you do not ask that question, you lose your job. I don't believe that would happen today. I think it would be the reverse if that question was asked of a minor, and I hope that that would be the case, that they would lose their job for asking that question. In recently researching a book that I'm putting together, I knew that in the archives at the New South Wales Library, that headline was ready to print on the basis of what I said at that time. This was leading into an Olympics. So for me, when it comes to being accused of being gay, this is what my interpretation of it was. And so I only thought of being gay as a negative. I never saw the side of it, which is the positive, the great community that is there, the things that we do together, and I wasn't in a world where I could really experience that. When you multiply that with my sporting achievements at what was a very young age, people were calling me a freak. So if you want to multiply gay times freak and someone who is growing up at that very awkward age in the public eye, it makes for a very difficult circumstance in even trying to accept your own sexuality, in being able to accept your authentic self. In doing the research for this book, I've also spoken to other top athletes who, some of them have come out during their careers and others have come out post-career. Most definitely female athletes have led the way and have done far better than what men have. We have great representatives that have come, whether it be a Billie Jean King, who was one of the first athletes that have followed. We've had very few in elite sport that are male that have come out, but we all have the same kind of anecdotal experience where we've heard how this is actually going to impact on our careers, how we'll lose our fan base, and then also the complications that it will cause for the teams that we actually compete on. So had I come out, there would have been a significant change that would have happened in my career. The places where we competed, for example, some of them would not welcome me in any way. Some have the death penalty. Some of the places where we had our training camps, I recently went to one which has thankfully changed some of its laws around same-sex attraction and the rights to actually be in love with the person that you love, which happened to be Singapore. They'd replaced Kazan to actually host the World Championships in Singapore, and that was where I would have been training, but at that time, when I was competing, homosexuality was against the law, so I wouldn't have been able to join my teammates whilst I was there. Now, whilst we're talking about locations of where sport takes place, it would be remiss of me to not recognise the recent Football World Cup. It took place in a place that does not pay respect to human rights. And it becomes a dilemma for athletes. What do you do in this situation? How do you speak up? And if so, will it be heard? We also have to ask the question, when it comes to hosting events, who we actually award these events and which places are acceptable. Do we actually wait for the perfect, or do we give encouragement that we have seen progress? And in some countries, we have seen progress when it comes to the rights of the LGBTIQA+ community. And that is a broader question that I do not have time to answer today. So when it comes to sporting teams, they have a tremendous amount of influence on young people. And we know that, and especially in who's watching sport. You may be a gay person growing up who happens to not watch sport, but the people around you do. And so the impact that they have in influencing what is tolerable behaviour and what is acceptable behaviour is very important, that it is actually displayed in an appropriate way. So whilst I'm talking about football, let's talk about another type of football. We actually have something called the NRL, which is one of our football codes, one of many in this country. And we had an issue last year with one of the teams where a number of players refused to play in a pride round. Their reason for not playing in the pride round was because because of their religious beliefs. The athletes weren't notified until very late. They weren't educated around the importance of why a pride round would be included and what impact it could have on the community. But these athletes decided, even with little information, that they would not compete in this. The NRL has basically copped out and is looking at introducing what is called a respect round. Now, in my understanding of sport, Sport is supposed to have fair play in it. So shouldn't every round be about respect? Respect for each other, respect for our differences, and respect for the competition, and having respect and decency towards yourself. We put athletes up on a pedestal as role models to the community. I think we should think of that as the exception, especially when we're seeing some athletes that are actually putting with their actions people who are at risk, at even greater risk. We know that there's an increased rate of mental health issues that come with the LGBTIQA+ community. We also know that there's an increased rate of suicidality within our community. That becomes even worse when we look especially at trans people. And given that trans is being an issue, especially around sport, that people are trying to weaponize, it's an area that needs to be discussed. And as we've discussed already today, we haven't had enough research to be able to make accurate assessments for what fair play would look like with the inclusion of trans athlete. My question for those athletes that aren't willing to actually wear a few colours on their shirt that mean so much to so many other people, to so many people within our community, really is why. I understand that you may have a religious belief, but I also hold my own beliefs. I'm about to go on a trip where I'm walking with some of the most marginalised people on the planet, and they have been for thousands of years. And I'm willing to walk with them because I actually see when you support one social justice cause, you should support another. This will have no impact on my belief, but will bring light to the increase of anti-Semitism around the world. And hopefully that will create some level of change through understanding. And I think when we go back to those athletes, for them not to understand what it's like for a young gay person or someone within the gay community to grow up and to face disadvantage, to face discrimination, to have to be able to fight, to hear what are horrible things that are said all too often. And one of the things that I think needs to happen in sport is getting rid of the casual homophobia. It has to happen at school, and it has to happen across all sport. It doesn't matter if it's participation sport or elite sport. We would not accept it around racism, and it should be the same around the homophobic slurs that we may hear from our fellow teammates without realising, without having the intent that this could be harmful. There was a period where kids at school were using the "that's gay" phrase, and what is offensive about this is the kids didn't realise that that is actually hurtful to some people. And when you explain it to them, they get it. And they said, but we don't really mean it that way. And I said, but you don't understand how people will interpret it. And language is important. And I also remind those kids, I've never heard anyone say "that's gay" to something that's positive. It's always in the negative. There's also blatant homophobia associated with sport that we actually see from the crowds. And it is something that needs to be called out. It's something that should be penalised when we're watching sport, because sport should be a place of inclusivity for all of us. It starts for all of us as part of our education in understanding the human condition. And that's where we should be able to compete, we should be able to perform, and we should be able to do it in a safe environment where we are equal and we are welcomed in that area. And anyone who disrespects that shouldn't have the right to enjoy the pleasures of watching the human form and seeing what we can do with our bodies. So for me, I have to say that homophobia is the same as racism, and we need to call it out in the same way that we wouldn't tolerate in any way some of the racist things that have been said previously, and we should not tolerate what is said to us about any of those homophobic slurs, the little things, the things that people say, boys are just being boys. This is not good enough, and we need to move on from it. We need to teach young children that it isn't tolerable, it isn't acceptable within a sporting community. I haven't had an opportunity, and I'm looking at the time and I know we're tight, to actually discuss, but I'm sure it will come up during the panel discussion, some of the issues around trans participation in sport. I have an opinion on this, and it differs from my governing body. I quite simply, and it was different to what Ricky's story was, that her sport got it right, my sport got it wrong. But it is a moving discussion. But I'm going to end on something positive. So when it comes to homophobia in sport, we actually are getting somewhere. We are improving, even though some areas are regressing back to something that isn't reflective of a positive improvement. It's, one step forward, two steps back. So I've got two stats for you, because I actually particularly like stats. So at the Tokyo Olympic Games, there were more out Olympians than had been at every Olympic Games in the lead up to those games. So that's the rate that we are improving. And if you can't see it, you can't be it. And so that's why it's important to have these athletes that we can look up to, that are role models for us, that represent all of us, represent our communities, and represents the diversity of a country like Australia, or where they represent, but also what message that sends to people who do not have the same kind of progressive attitudes that we have in a developed country like Australia. My other stat, last one, another positive. So from 2012 to the Tokyo Olympics, now I have to admit this is starting from a very low number, we've actually seen the number of people who are out at the Olympic Games increase by 700%. So in less than 10 years, we've seen that improvement. So let's hope that that continues. And thank you all for being here and listening today.